That was Joe Mandica performing our classic pop culture theme song. Joe is Australia's gift to the world of pop music, and he's the writer, producer, and performer of our opening theme. Joe is a true friend of the show. And speaking of true friends of the show, how are all of you doing? Thank you so much for taking out some time to watch and listen to the show. I'm your most gracious host, Steve Ludwig, welcoming you to another edition of Steve Ludwig's Classic Pop Culture, right here at planetludwig.com. Here we are, show number 181, and our guest is author J.E. Tobin. Now, Dr. Tobin, in his younger years, was a victim of sexual abuse, and he has written an absolutely brilliant novel about a victim of sexual abuse. It's called When We Were Wolves. Now, Dr. Tobin is quite an accomplished writer. He's written plays, children's books, children's musicals, short stories. He's had numerous articles published in magazines. He's written educational textbooks. But When We Were Wolves is his first novel. And what a debut novel it is. Now, despite the serious nature of the story, we even managed to have a few lighthearted moments during our conversation, as you'll hear. Now, we did a Zoom interview just 3 days ago, and I think it's time for us to get into it right now. And we are joined by author J.E. Tobin. Magnificent When We Were Wolves. Dr. Tobin, thank you so much for joining us.
Call me Jim, Steve.
Thank you. I will. My pleasure. Nice to meet you, Jim.
Same here. Same here. I've heard a lot about you. I've read some of your, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and I find some of the interviews enlightening, fun, interesting, and I hope to read more. I loved Little Anthony. I loved S.E. Hinton.
Mm-hmm.
I loved some of the other things you had about the Beatles.
Please, oh, Beatleman. I've been so lucky, and the guests are so they're so giving. I've really been lucky to talk to them, and I'm lucky to talk to you as well, because your book is magnificent.
Great.
Now, part of the joy of reading, as far as I'm concerned, I think a lot of people would agree with me, is reading the book and discovering what's happening in the book for the first time. So I'm going to ask you to walk a delicate balance here, without giving too much away. What can you tell us about When We Were Wolves that would give the audience a good enough idea, but we don't want to give we want to leave the good stuff for them to find out to themselves.
Yeah,
how's that for laying it all on you, Jim?
Good. Well, we definitely don't want to give the ending away.
No.
Or the middle, or anything else that would deprive them of
no, exactly
themselves. I would be upset if somebody gave me the ending of a book.
Sure.
So I'm not going to give you the ending of the book, but I will tell you a little bit about what it's about. So it's the story of a man, an ordinary man, somebody who lives a simple life in a small town in Virginia. But he's a man who has buried some painful childhood memories deep within his psyche. But then there's breaking news about a national celebrity that forces him to confront his past and begin this quest to bring his boyhood idol, hero, to justice. Then as the stakes grow larger, he finds himself at odds with his friends, his family, and then a national media that is obsessed with people who have fame and fortune. So to do the right thing, he must risk hurting everyone that he loves and everything that he loves. And Lee learned what it means to be a true hero. I like to think that it's sort of a book that is a modern day version of David and Goliath, except
Well put.
except that the hero uses headlines instead of a slingshot.
Very, very, very well put. Yep.
Yeah. So that's it. That's what I like to give to the audience and let them find out more about themselves.
Yes, and as we continue with this conversation, Jim, we're going to get little teasers here and there, but audience, you will just adore this book, and just when you think you know what's going to happen next, Jim will throws you for a loop, and it's the best. So let's get into it, okay, Jim?
Great.
Okay.
Think of Joe Paterno. Do you remember Joe Paterno?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Okay, back in 2012, his assistant, Jerry Sandusky, got into tremendous trouble, legal trouble,
Yeah.
because he had spent years abusing young men. And somehow Joe Paterno kind of enabled that. Yet people thought of him as a god. So that was back in 2012. And at that time, I said to myself, wow, look at all the tremendous publicity and notoriety that is happening in this case. And yet imagine if it was Joe Paterno instead of Jerry Sandusky, who was the one abusing. That started me thinking, and I have a little black book, and I write possible ideas for writing in my little black book. Years later, what was happening with the Me Too movement and with Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and everything else, it made me think, wow, this is a story that needs telling. So that's what happened.
I was trying to think, Jim, of the words I could use to describe, like, one shot words. And I mean, I can't do it in one word, but I mean, brilliant, marvelous, magnificent. I cannot give you enough kudos for this incredible job you did writing this book.
Wow. Thanks. Well, it was a labor of love, 4 years of work. And did a lot of research, went through a lot of drafts. I have a writing group that I work with, and really fine writers in themselves, and they actually read my works along with my wife and others, and gave me a lot of feedback. So it was great.
You mentioned you did a lot of research. I know this is a novel, but is any part of this autobiographical?
Well, every piece of fiction, I think, has some of the author's life experiences. If you look at different characters, elements of every character has a piece of me in it too. So there are some things that are autobiographical, but Tom's story is very different than mine. Okay. I mean, I was abused as a child.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, apparently it's more common than people think.
Right, yeah.
Well, from what the research I did was about 1 in 6 to 1 in 15 men, by the time they're an adult, they've been abused by a predator. In the case of women, it's a much greater number. But only till recently have we started realizing how many, for instance, women are abused when they're young. But I think abuse of males is actually still pretty much hidden. So I think there are some elements, but as I said, his story is very different than mine. My experience is very different than his. I lived in New York City. I lived in Hoboken. I'm not in Hoboken, but Union City, place like that. Tom lives in a small town. And now I live in a small town, so I use that experience. But I had to do a lot of research about Williamsburg, Virginia, in order to write about this book too. So, a character. I was never a basketball coach, but I love basketball. So there's elements of that as well. So.
And the fact that you said it in a small town, Jim, everyone knows everybody's business in a small town too. I think that greatly added to, I almost want to call this an adventure book, but it added greatly to the adventure of the story that how is Tom ever going to reach his goal, what he wants to happen. And it was just like we mentioned before, just the intricacies and the subplots and the twists and turns, really, really just so appreciated by me as a reader.
Well, I thank you for that. Interesting thing in my thinking about the book is that I see it as literary fiction because it's really character driven. It's told through the voice of Tom. So you as the reader gets a chance to really get inside Tom's head and really understand what he's going through as he tries to figure out how he's going to solve this problem that he has of how to deal with a person who is his adversary now, who has so much power, has so much fame, has so many people rooting for him. And here is this man who is just, as I said, is just an ordinary man. And how does he stand up to this man and this powerful entity? And think about it. So think about that in the sense that has to figure a way to somehow convince not only the legal system and not only the media, but his own family, his own friends, his whole neighborhoods, the people that he grew up with, who all love and honor the great Sonny Rollins, who was a local high school coach who made good. So he was a small town boy who made good and became a famous national celebrity coach. You think about someone like Joe Paterno, you think somebody like Coach K or Bobby Knight or Newt Rockney or any of these people.
Gods, with a small G, but gods.
That's right, gods. And you think about, well, what if you go up against them? Not so easy. And so he has to figure a way to somehow even the sides. So therefore he can somehow convince others that Sonny needs to be brought to justice.
Yeah. I think it might be a good time for the audience. I'd like to read one of the reviews, one of the quotes from a review by, of all people, Whoopi Goldberg,
right,
who's a fan of your writing. Here's what she wrote. When a novel poses a question, asks you if you could stand up and face the storm, I know it's going to stay with me. And that's what J.E. Tobin's When We Were Wolves does. When we were kids, we were taught to trust adults and not to question. But When We Were Wolves will remind you of your duty to question for your own well-being. It reminds us that heroes are human beings, just like us.
right.
So well put by Whoopi Goldberg. And, Jim, just a minute or so ago, you said that not only did the character Tom had to overcome the newspapers and media and things like that, but he had to overcome his small town family and friends. To me, that was just as, if not greater, than having to overcome the media.
Right. Well, his small town is really character in the book.
Yes.
If you think about it, if you really delve into it, that it becomes a character. All the characters in the book in some ways respond to living in this small town, which is almost a perfect small town.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful town, a college town. It has historical components. It has people who have gone on to be presidents.
Yeah.
People who are famous, famous in and of themselves, who in some ways carry with them memories that that Tom has to deal with. Because I mean, there's one great scene that I love when Tom goes running in the middle of the night because he can't sleep.
Yeah. Oh.
And he goes running through the town, and he kind of imagines the streets, the empty streets of the town, as coming alive in a horror movie, if you remember that. Right?
Yes, I do.
And the little white houses he mentions, all kind of hiding something, like in a movie where you see the opening shot of a movie, a horror movie, and it kind of zooms in to see little strange things happening. And as he runs through the town, he eventually goes past the church. He goes past all the places in his life which he's grown up in, that he feels so connected to, and yet he feels like it's a strange place. And he winds up sitting next to a statue of Thomas Jefferson, and he starts talking to him. And you might think, well, that's a little strange, a little magic realism, but what it is that in his mind, he's trying to search for some answers to what he's going to do with all the emotions that are rising up in him. So he starts talking to Thomas Jefferson, who then talks back to him. Yeah. And it's a wonderful scene because Thomas Jefferson gives him some advice. And yet it's believable, I think it's believable enough, that in his mind, it's real to him. And as I said, the town becomes a character that he has to, in some ways, come to terms with himself. That he loves this town, yet he also fears this town, because like any small town, everybody knows your business. I remember when I was a young man and I lived in a neighborhood of a small town in Union City, and you would go out and play with your friends, and there would be always somebody looking out the window and said, "Jimmy Tobin, I know it's you, I'm telling your mother."
Yep. Yes.
The wonderful thing is that there's a sense of community, but also you pay a price for that.
So, it's a double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword. And in this case, it almost becomes like this story almost becomes a suspense thriller, I think. The reader is always kind of on the edge of what is going to happen next. They think they know, and then all of a sudden, some twist and turn, and they're on a different path. It's just like Tom is.
Absolutely, so well put. And listeners, I hate to be cliche, but I could not put this book down. It does read like an adventure, and the subject matter is, of course, so serious and so overwhelming. Yet you can't wait to see what is going to happen next. And just when you think, everyone, that you know what's going to happen, take my word, you don't know what's going to happen, because Jim throws in something else. It's like, oh my God, how is Tom going to overcome this now? It's just, it's just such a great read. I can't recommend it enough.
Well, it keeps building the suspense. I mean, I think that's what was important, because the stakes have to keep increasing. In a really good book, in the books that I've read that I really enjoyed, the stakes for the main character always increase. He gets, or she, or he, always engages in something. And as they try to solve one problem, it creates new problems. That's what happens here too.
Like life.
Like life.
Like real life.
Except in fiction, you have heightened life. Everything that seems like one of the challenges for the writer is to make something like dialogue, for instance. Dialogue is not real conversation. nobody really speaks like you have dialogue in a book,
Mm-hmm.
a movie, or in a play. It seems real. There's an illusion that it's real, but it's not real. Nobody really speaks like that. But you
Right.
have to have that kind of heightened drama and tension in order to keep the reader involved and moving forward, because you want them to turn the page.
Absolutely. And what I liked so much, I mean, we all serious readers know this. A book is not worth anything if you don't care about the characters.
Right.
And so much about these characters is just so real. And there are no perfect people.
No.
And everyone in this book is someone that at least I know I could identify with.
Right.
That, yeah, I can see the wife's point of view. I can see, this person's point. I understand where they're coming from. Yet poor Tom is fighting this. And it's just, you care about everybody. You really do. And I don't want to hate, but you learn to dislike.
Like, why does Megan, the wife, who loves Tom like no other, who's had this great relationship for these many years, why doesn't she stand up for him in the very beginning?
Yes.
And you wonder, but then you start to understand what's driving her and why at first she wants him to stay quiet, to not reveal, because at first she didn't know. And she just knew that there was something the matter with him, that he was having some kind of inner angst, and that she couldn't understand why he was acting so strangely. So it's only about maybe a third way through the book, he finally tells her, he works up the courage to tell her. And when he does, she surprises him by trying to get him to stay silent. But as we follow the story, we realize the reason, her motivation for why she wants him to keep quiet. But then, just as you mentioned, things shift. There was a shift at one point where then she's fully behind him.
Yes.
And going after Sonny.
And that's that big,
also makes sense too.
Yes, that as a reader, I said, oh, finally, she's, and I remember thinking, Jim, like at the beginning, like you said, come on, back your husband up, this poor guy. And it was when it finally happens, it was like, yes. And that's what I mean about the adventure part too. It's just, it reads, you just can't wait to see what's going to happen in each scene, because Jim, you have us readers knowing that we don't know what's going to happen. Even though you might be setting us up, something else comes up, and it's you can't put it down. You cannot put it down.
Thanks.
I noticed too, which I think is I have a theory as to why you may have done this, but the setting of the story is present day. You even allude to the COVID pandemic. Was there a particular reason for making it present day, or you didn't put that much thought into it?
Actually, I did put a lot of thought in that.
Yes, I'm sure you did.
Because I felt, well, you could almost pick, Tom is 40 years old. So you could pick any time in those 4 years to pick up the story. But I picked up the story on a day that he hears the news that Sonny Rollins, the great Sonny Rollins, everybody's hometown hero, everybody's national hero, on the day that he gets arrested for abusing an 11-year-old boy. That's the inciting incident. That's the incident that drives the rest of the story. And because what it does is it presents Tom with now a choice, which he felt he never didn't have until that moment. And so why did I pick the day of his 40th birthday to start that? And why did I pick the present day rather than set it, back in the 80s or the 90s? Because I think there's a lot going on right now. You have a lot of big changes in our society. You have globalization. You have the rise of technology and the internet, and you have changes in work structure, in climate change. You have changes in people's roles, men and women, different races, different ethnic groups. You have COVID. You have all these things that are putting tremendous pressure on people, on families, on institutions, and all that creates drama. And I felt that what Tom was going through is something that he could have gone through at any point. People have gone through that same trauma for thousands of years, practically, if you think of that. But if he's going through it here, and especially since he's the narrator, it's going through his mind, and you're in some ways part of his journey, because you are also in his head. By going through it at this time, you have more of an understanding of your own life. Give you an example. He's going through, one of the things he has to deal with is the media. One of the things he has to deal with is fame, people's fame and powerful interests. And if you think about what's been happening with COVID and about what's been happening in politics and everything else, a lot of us feel, I don't know about you, but I know I do, and people I talk to feel in some ways powerless.
I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay, so we feel powerless. Now, Tom feels powerless. Tom feels powerless against Sonny, but he also feels powerless against the media. He feels powerless against all the forces that are coming down on him because he dares to speak out against this man. So it seemed to me that this was a perfect time to bring this up. I mean, think about the pandemic and people's emotions during the pandemic and the feeling of isolation that they have. Well, nobody can feel more isolated than somebody who's kept a secret for 30 years, a painful secret. Imagine that.
Sure.
So,
and that brings up another point, and I'm going to get to it in a second, but before I get too far ahead of myself, here's how I interpreted also why you may have put it in the present day.
sure.
Makes it so obvious, and it is anyway, I suppose, but this problem is not a problem of the past. This is a problem that is present day, and it just continues to rear its ugly head.
Well, in that way, I kind of disagree with you because I feel that this story is really not, the conflict in this story is not the trauma that he faces, which I think actually has been, I think that's a trauma that if you think about in the history of human beings, adults sometimes have taken advantage of children, both men and women, ever since time began. And sometimes it was actually seen as societally acceptable. But I don't think that's the central theme of the story. I don't think it is child abuse. I think it's about courage. I think it's about what do you do when you know what the right thing is? But to do so, it means you have to risk. You have to risk hurting the people you love, as I mentioned in the beginning. Risk hurting the people you love, risk losing everything you treasure. That to me is courage.
Yes. And I see that.
Interesting thing that's happened is there's one part of the story that talks about he goes up to Richmond and he's meeting up with an old friend of his in Richmond, and the friend lives on Monument Boulevard, where they're in the process of deciding what to do with those monuments.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to tear down these monuments to Civil War generals and Civil War leaders on the Confederate side?
Yep.
You know, what are they going to do? And so it to me, it was a sense of how does Tom tear down this myth that has been created about Sonny Rollins? It's the same thing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That was the right thing to do. Probably was the right thing to do, to tear down these monuments to rebellion against the states, you know.
Right.
But so to me, I felt that was an essential part. In fact, I think I wrote something like, memories like monuments are cast in stone, yet crumble over time. You know?
Oh, yes.
That's what memories do.
I remember that.
And in some ways, this book is a story about not only courage, but memories.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do with memories, and how memories are sometimes formed and they're imperfect. And we have memories that, you know, if you ask 3 or 4 people to remember the same thing, they don't, because each of us sees what we experienced at the time differently.
From their perspective, sure.
And also over time, those memories change as we get new experiences. Mm-hmm. So I even chose the name of the main character, Tom Winfield. Tom Winfield is actually a character in Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie.
Sure.
And the funny thing was that when I was trying to get blurbs for the book, like Whoopi's and Michael Gurian and others, I wrote to many authors and people who I thought might be willing to give me a break and read my book and then give me a blurb. And there's one very famous writer, I won't mention her name, because she said she had 67 books on her, I think she said 67 books on her night table. And she couldn't add another one to try to read. But she said, I do want to tell you, though, that you have your main character as a character. You use the name of a character in the Glass Menagerie. So maybe you want to change that. And I wrote back to her, I said, no, I did that on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt that this, just like Tennessee Williams' Glass Menagerie was a memory play, my book, When We Were Wolves, is a memory book. It's a book where the theme of memories keeps popping up. There's so many ideas about memories. And so anyway, that was
Jim, why don't we at this time, can you explain the title, please? When We Were Wolves?
When We Were Wolves. A perfect segue, because it's his memory. Mm-hmm. His memory of the summer when he was 11 years old. And he was learning to play basketball. He loved basketball. And so that was the summer when he joined a recreational team. Mm-hmm. And he was the smallest player on the team, but he was, as he said, I had stamina. I could run and run and run. Mm-hmm. So his memory of that was very powerful. And he loved the fact that he was with all these bigger guys and that he was on the team. In fact, he made the All-Star team. And that All-Star team had the nickname the Wolves. Mm-hmm. And Sonny Rollins, who was the coach, said to them, he wanted them to play together. He wanted them to work together. So he showed them a film, a documentary about wolves. And he showed them how wolves work together to attack and catch their prey. And that if one succeeds, then the next will come and attack from another way, that they work together, they cooperate. And then he had them howling like wolves. Mm-hmm. And so even at some point in the story, he gets together with a friend and they howl like wolves. Yeah. And there's also a motif of wolves throughout. At one point, he refers to the pack of media like a wolf pack they were. Mm-hmm. And at another time, he's listening to the sounds at night and he hears a sound and he said, it sounds like a wolf. it couldn't be a wolf, not here in this small town. He said, but it does sound like a wolf. And that's the memories. The memories are, at one time, they were good memories, but that memory of that summer have really lurked around. And it's every once in a while come back to threaten him, like a wolf pack. And so, anyway, that's where the title comes from.
And when you describe that summer of what happened to Tom, you didn't pull any punches either, Jim. And I commend you for that. I mean, it was very uncomfortable, as it should be, to read, but you didn't kind of tiptoe around it. And again, such credit to you for really being real about it.
Well, I'm glad that you said that. And I'm glad that as a man, you said that, because I think that one of the things that's important is that men, unfortunately, grow up thinking they have to always be strong, can never show any feelings except anger. Like when I was growing up, I could show all the anger I wanted. You know, I could get on that street and you know, fight that guy, but I could never show any other emotions, you know. And so one of the things that I think is very important is that you can never show weakness as a man too, growing up.
Yeah.
So to be someone who is a victim, someone who is vulnerable, to me, that was important to show. And he was in some ways a victim of a man who was grooming him and was a predator, like a wolf. Again, going back to the motif of wolf. And I felt I was wondering if I should be as honest in showing what happened as because I didn't want to turn the reader off. And so that was probably the most difficult challenge I had, was to write enough that you know what happens, what the grooming process is, and yet not so much that you'd be turned off. That you realize that this is a man who's a predator and how he operates. So you have to understand that. And you have to then understand what it does to the victim and how it works. But you don't want to have so much that you turn off the reader. And I was hoping that I wouldn't. And one of the things
it was a delicate balance that you handled perfectly.
Yeah, and one of the things that also I just want to mention too is that I thought this was a book for everyone, even though it's about a man, even though it's about an experience that he had as a boy, that there are very strong women in this, and women who are very important to the whole plot and to the whole notion of courage and the ability to get through trauma and physical trauma. And these women are very interesting characters. And I found that it was a challenge to write, but so
strong characters.
Strong characters.
Yeah. Now, with your background in psychology, I almost feel like I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it. And you kind of alluded to it just a few minutes ago, but is it that macho thing with many men? I don't want to, it's
right.
I don't want to paint an umbrella thing, but why they seem to wait longer to come forward or to admit this than women do? If they've been abused. I know women wait some, let me see, how am I trying to get around this, Jim? You said men are less likely to come forward than women.
The numbers show it. The statistics show it.
Is it because of that macho thing?
I did a lot of research on this.
Yeah.
There's two things. One is that there is cultural reasons why that is. Women do talk with each other more than men do on emotional issues. So they're more, generally, more willing to reveal things. But if you think about it, there's been a cultural shift, even among women. There was a time in the 50s and the 60s when things were happening, and we knew things were happening. We grew up when male and female roles were very different. And expectations of what males and females do in relationship with each other was very different. But that has shifted. The culture has shifted. So women are more empowered than they used to be. So they're more likely to come forward. But that's only been recent too. I mean, if you think about it, the Harvey Weinstein case happened only in 2017. He spent decades abusing women, and women who then were either afraid or intimidated to come out. And in fact, there was the whole notion, if you look at old movies and look about the casting couch, and that seemed like the norm.
It's joked about. It was joked about.
It was joked about.
Yeah, no big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's a cultural shift now.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing has to happen with men eventually, is that because I think men, and this isn't just about sexual abuse. It could be, dealing with the loss of a parent, dealing with, a friend that's been traumatized. One of the books that I've been working on and finished is called Triple Divide. It's about 3 soldiers who come back from Afghanistan, and one of them is really hurting, and yet he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't share. And one of the things I spent some time in was in a VA hospital in a psychiatric unit, and there were men there who were hurting and everything else, but they were still under the culture of you can't talk about it. You can't talk about pain or suffering or closeness to others. And so I think it's just a cultural shift, and I think it's changing too with men, but still we have a long way to go.
Yeah. You mentioned Triple Divide. We will certainly, we have so much more to talk about with When We Were Wolves, but being you brought it up, Triple Divide, that book is finished, or you're putting the finishing touches on it?
Yeah, the book is finished. There might be some you always can do more in a book.
Yeah. You know what, Jim, do you feel with your writings, and I'm going to mention your other books too, do you ever feel like, oh man, is it ready? Is it ready? And then when it's published, you say, oh shoot, I should have done this. Or are you generally happy with your releases so far?
Good question. I think the answer to that is think of being a parent. You do your best, you try your best. If you put in as much effort as you possibly can, and maybe even more than you think you can, and then your son or your daughter kind of goes off into life, well, maybe you weren't perfect, maybe you could have done more, but you hope that they can stand on their own 2 feet. I feel the same way as a writer. I work hard, I work on drafts, I go over a draft so many times. Each time, give an example, we talked about dialogue and trying to make dialogue as real as possible, yet it's an illusion. So I might go over every single line of dialogue 50 times and take out a word here and change a thing here. And so it's never finished, but on the other hand, at some point, there has to stand on its own, just like your son or your daughter.
Yeah. I would imagine as a writer, that has to be one of the most difficult things to say, I'm done, that's it. Where you spent years, 4 years working on this book, going through with a fine-tooth comb, and you say, I guess this is it. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Jim, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that in some ways, you're glad to be rid of the damn thing.
Yeah.
Because you want to get to something else. You have another story to tell. You have more things. I told you a little bit about Triple Divide, but I'm actually working, and I put off in the last couple of months working on this new novel because I had to try to market this. I had to try to get people to write blurbs. I had to try to get interviews. I had to try to get the book signings. And it's not easy when you're coming from a small publisher. Even in the big publishers nowadays, it's very different than when I first started writing back in the 70s, when I wrote some children's books for Macmillan. Well, they took care of all the marketing. They had people who were paid full time to market the books. So I didn't have to worry about it. Now writers have to do a lot more of that work. So I've been working on a book about Buffalo Soldiers, about a woman who called Addie Rose, and it's called The Last Outpost of Addie Rose. And Addie Rose is a woman who in mid 1800s, her family was killed in an Indian massacre by the Comanches, and she went to live. She was captured, abducted, and brought into the tribe, and she was married off to a chief, but then rescued by soldiers. But because she was tainted, she never married, and she had to live on outposts, frontier outposts, until she met a man, a Buffalo soldier, a black soldier from the 9th Cavalry, who fell in love with her, married her, and they had to deal with all kinds of prejudice and all kinds of other things. And the book opens in 1907, not during the Wild West. It's now a whole different age. And during that time, he gets assigned to be an instructor at West Point in horsemanship. And she comes along with him. And it's the story about her awakening for the first time to who she is in this new world that is no longer the frontier. It's now a pretty civilized place, West Point. So it's called The Last Outpost of Addie Rose. So I want to get back to that. It's a new book for me. It's a new story. So in some ways, I'd like to get rid of this book and get moving.
Yeah. Jim, how about, I've heard many times that some writers, they have something in mind, yet the story takes them somewhere where they didn't expect to go. Have you experienced that?
Many times.
Huh?
I've been very lucky to have that happen. Usually it's very hard work. And the story doesn't come so easily. But every once in a while, it's not the story that takes you, at least in my case, it's the character. The characters start to tell me where they want to go.
Yes, I've heard that so often.
Yes, because what you're doing is you're trying to make them as real and as breathing as possible. So what happens when somebody is real and breathing and a person? They're going to do what they want to do eventually. And so you have to, in some ways, guide them perhaps, but you have to be willing to listen to them and say, does this make a better story?
Yeah.
That I think, there's a place in the book where Tom, I think, is talking about what basketball means to him. And he mentions that sometimes in a game of basketball, everything seems to be going just like you want. You can't seem to miss. You're not getting tired. Every time you look down the court, you can see the court like you never saw before. You can pass the ball without looking because you somehow know where that person is. There's a flow to the game. And there's actually a psychological concept called flow. And it means when your mind gets into a certain state where everything seems effortless. And so that's what Tom was always searching for when he was playing basketball. And it's what he hopes to, teach his his players. But it's also true of writers, I think, and at least in my case, it's true that every once in a while, the gift that we receive is when our characters take us into places that we didn't think we were going, and it turns out to be a better place. A good example of that is the end of this book. And I'm not going to tell you because you read it, but I don't want the readers to know. But there's, in the end of the book, it's very different than what I had been working towards.
Is that
for
right?
3.5 years.
Mhm.
Only at the very end did the characters basically say, Jim, we're not going that way.
Mhm.
You know,
Amazing.
Tom
Yeah,
said to me, no, it's not about that.
that's amazing.
It's about something else. And
Mhm.
so give it up, Jim. Don't try to force us to go in this direction. Go with me, Tom said. And I did, and I think the book ends much better than I first thought it would.
That's incredible to hear.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic feeling when that happens. It's almost like, as I mentioned, it feels like a gift.
Yeah. Do you put aside certain times during the, do you, in other words, write 5 hours a day, so to speak, Monday through Friday, or when it hits you, and then you write?
Well,
Do you make
if-
yourself write?
If I did it when it hits me, I probably wouldn't be right that much. You have to force yourself to sit down. So usually I'll have some coffee, I'll read the paper, whatever, and then I get started. If I'm really excited about something, sometimes I'll work more than 4 hours or 5 hours or so.
Mhm.
But generally, I like to work best during the day, early in the day. And then if I have time, and I might go back. But sometimes, as I mentioned about the flow, if things are flowing, I don't want to leave that feeling.
Yeah, I can
want to
imagine.
continue. So I might write for a lot longer.
Yeah.
And it's no Monday through Friday. It's usually, if I don't have any pressing things like doctor's appointments or traveling.
If
or
life
anything
doesn't interfere.
life does, because really writing to me is not only a job, it's also playing. It's also in some ways unleashing a creative spirit. It's what you felt as a kid. I mean, like there's a scene in the book where Tom is talking about his one-time best friend, who was only his best friend until he was getting towards high school.
Mhm.
And then he kind of left his friend behind. But his friend and he used to get together in the basement and create worlds for themselves, if you remember.
Right. Yes, I
Victor, and so Victor and he used to create these worlds where good triumphed over evil, and human beings treated each other in ways that they should treat each other.
Mhm.
And I always felt that if you watch little children playing, and they'll pick up something, they'll pick up sticks, or they'll pick up rocks, and they create something, and it's usually a very playful experience. Well, for me, sometimes writing is that.
Mhm. That's nice to hear. What do you think about the banning of books, or the movement to ban certain books?
Well, that actually has been something that's been going on periodically over many
Oh, yeah.
eons. You know,
The
I think I
current,
mentioned
the current movement, we'll put it that way.
yeah, the current movement. I don't like it. I remember when I was a young man and I was writing freelance, and I was writing children's books for Macmillan and Scholastic and Harcourt Braves and all these big companies that would create these reading series and books and reading materials and instructional materials for schools. And I remember sitting in an office of my editor, who I loved. She was so supportive of me and everything else. And she was telling me how much she loved this new manuscript I gave her. She said, I think it's one of the best things you've done. And she said, but we can't use it. And I said, why? You just told me how good this was. Why can't you? She goes, well, because it has to play in Texas. And what she meant was that in Texas, they buy a lot of textbooks. They buy a lot of reading materials. They buy a lot of, because it's such a big state and because they don't allow a lot of, at least in those days, didn't allow a lot of freedom of choice to the teachers. It was the Board of Education or the State Board of Education that decided on what goes into the schools. So therefore, they had a lot of clout because if they buy a lot of materials, that's millions of dollars. And
sure,
if the publisher wants, then if the publisher thinks that Texas won't like something, they're not going to put it in, even if Texas might have accepted it. But they're trying to second guess Texas, because if they spend all this money producing something and then it goes through the process and then gets banned or not accepted at that point, that's already a lot of money that's been spent.
Follow the money, right, Jim? We hear that all the time.
Follow the money. So what she had me do, she says, if you want to get paid for this and me buy this, I have to change it. And so I allowed her to do it, and I was really sorry I did, because it came out much worse. And if it was such a minor thing, and I didn't know why it was so supposed to, it wasn't sexual. It was that the bad guy in the book was a sheriff. That's all it was. But they said, well, you can't say anything bad about law enforcement in Texas. That was it. So that was my introduction to book banning, or to the book business. And I think Judy Blume, who's written a lot of children's books.
Yes, sure.
She once said that it's bad enough that they ban books, but what's worse is all the books that are never written and will never be read because the people that produce books will try to figure out what will be banned,
what needs to be censored, and so on and so forth.
And the thing about, if you look at these books that get banned, usually they're great books, or at least books. But what they do, each book has an idea in it, and they'd rather have something that has no ideas, or have ideas that only a small group of people believe. Rather than my philosophy is, when I was teaching, and I know you were a teacher, my idea is that I want to expose my students to as many different ideas as possible and help them think through things. You know, I don't give them the answers, but I want them to think about it, you know?
Yes,
and
sure.
I still have students back from the days 40, 50 years ago who still contact me and say, Jim, remember when you taught us rebellion? And or remember when you taught us this or that? And now they may grow up to be very different than me, but that's what I want. I wanted them to be somebody who could look at different ideas, be exposed. And I think it's a better world if children get to think about different kinds of people. They learn about different ways of living. I think it's better if children learn how to disagree with each other. And I think the world would be a lot better place.
Yeah, well said. I'm completely with you on that, Jim.
Yeah.
You know, I still have some more to talk about with When We Were Wolves, but I would love to talk about your background a bit.
Okay.
I want to tell our audience that Jim and I are both Hudson County, New Jersey boys. I'll never lose my accent. I don't know if I could tell from yours, Jim, that you grew up in Union City, New Jersey, but I want to thank your brother John John Tobin. He and I graduated high school together in North Bergen, New Jersey. We played football together. We actually left our knees in Bricktown, New Jersey, in a game. In the same game, we both got
Really?
injured. But I
What
want to
position
thank
did you
John
play?
because I've kind of kept in touch, John, with your brother over the years, and he's the one who turned me on to your book.
Great.
And I read it. I said, "Oh my gosh, I love having authors on the show, and I am so glad that I got to read this book and to meet you." But tell us a little bit more about your background, please.
Could I ask you a little bit about your background first?
Sure.
What position did you play on the football team?
I was halfback and a defensive safety.
You were fast.
Your brother opened up the line for me, and I was able to stat right through.
He could open a lot of lines.
We both love you, John. We both love you.
Could I tell you a funny story?
Sure, please do.
I told him that I patterned Mark, the friend Mark, after my brother.
Wow.
Mark. I don't know if you see any resemblance, but I said, if you remember in the book, I described this guy who was the friend of Tom, and he's a really big guy who invariably, whenever they went out partying, some other guy would come and bypass everybody else and pick him to fight and to pick on. And so I remember a time I was in Greenwich Village, and he and his friends came over to visit me. I was living in the village, and we played on the West 4th Street basketball court, which was like a tiny postage size court, but it had great players. And so we get all sweaty and tired and everything else, and we go to a local bar, not a bar, it's more like a local Greenwich Village. It wasn't a bar, it was sort of like a restaurant that had a bar.
Mm-hmm.
We're sitting there and having lunch and having some drinks and stuff like that. And out of the corner of my eye, there's a glass window, and I see this big drunk guy, and he's weaving in front of this window and kind of looks in, and he starts walking towards the door. And I said, uh-oh, here it goes. So we're in this crowded restaurant. Sure enough, this guy weaves over to our table. Mm-hmm. And he says, and now I was 6'3", 190 pounds. My brother's 6'3" and weighs 250 pounds at that time. Probably weighed a lot more than that now. But at that time, and he was in good shape. And I would not have messed with him. I don't know too many sane people who would, but he walked right up to my brother. He says, I know you're talking about me. I know you're talking. And he's holding his fist like this. And I go to the guy and says, yeah, he was talking about you.
Thank you, big brother.
I was a big brother. But I knew this was like a big joke. I knew nothing would happen because my brother, despite all this, he's not going to get into a fight unless he possibly, there's no way.
Your brother's one of the, I assume he's the same way. He's one of the nicest guys that I went to high school with, and smart man as well.
So anyway, so he's Mark. He's like Mark. Also like Mark. Mark likes business. He likes. He's very ambitious, and my brother liked business and was that way.
Mm-hmm.
So how about? I forget.
What's that?
What were we talking about? I forget.
I was going to ask you about your background.
Oh, okay. So anyway, I grew up in Union City. I was born in Hoboken, raised in Union City, lived on 41st Street, but then moved to Chicago, lived there for 2 years, loved Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And but my father decided to come back, and we moved to 8th Street in Palisade Avenue. And it was a great neighborhood. So many kids and had so many great times. And I went to St. Michael's High School, St. Michael's Grammar School and High School, hated the nuns hated me. But I must say that there were 2 teachers that taught me that I could be a writer. The first one was in 6th grade, Miss Ludwig, and she was probably the only person who wasn't a nun in my school, and she was young, and I loved her, and I wanted to please her, but she always felt that I was late, and so she always was punishing me by having me write long essays. I mean, it's actually a terrible educational strategy, because you don't want kids to learn that writing is
bad
punishment. But anyway, she told me to write a 5,000-word essay, and I knew that she liked humor. So I wrote this 5,000-word essay, and I put her in Greenwich Village with beatniks and me, and all kinds of weird things were happening. And I thought it was the funniest thing. And my mother looked at it and read it. She goes, "This is really good, but are you sure Miss Luby will like this?" And I said, "Oh, she's going to love this. She likes the funny things." So sure enough, I give it to her, and she looked at me after she read it, and she says, "Mr. Tobin, go down to the principal." And I got suspended for writing this for a week.
My goodness. Oh my gosh.
For me to go home and tell my father that I got suspended from school.
Forget it. Like, in those days, yeah.
It was like going up to and stepping in front of the guillotine. But anyway, my mother brings me into school, and she's trying to convince the principal not to punish me. I mean, not to suspend me. And the principal says to my mother, "I loved the story." She says, "I loved the story." She goes, "It reminds me, the writing reminds me of my favorite author, this Catholic writer who I never heard about, Francois Mauriac." She said, "It's so wonderfully written." So I'm thinking, well, I'm going to get off. I'm not going to go be suspended. Right. And so my mother says, "Well, is he still going to be suspended?" She goes, "Yes, I have to defend my teachers."
Yeah,
so anyway,
that sounds familiar.
I got suspended. Well, my second teacher was my high school English teacher, Mr. Alvarez. And Mr. Alvarez took a liking to my writing. And he told me, he said, "Jim, you can be a writer, but it's tough to make a living as a writer. So what I'm going to do is send your stories to the World Telegram and Sun, to editors, and tell them that you're going to be a journalist, and so you can make a living." So I loved him. I think he was a great professor, made me a teacher, made me laugh. So that's where I went to journalism school. I became a journalism major, loved journalism, and I was going to be a sports reporter, not for my dreams. I wanted to be a novelist, but I figured I'd make money. I'd make a living, because I knew I didn't want to be a starving writer. So I'm ready to graduate college, but the Vietnam War is happening. And so I go to my professor, who was assistant sports editor at New York Times, big shot, really nice guy, and kind of my mentor. And I said, "Mr. Tewitt, Professor Tewitt, can I get a job on the New York Times?" He says, "Son, your draft status is going to be 1A. No one is going to hire you."
God, yeah.
Right? No one. So I was kind of crestfallen. I thought, well, I was going to be a reporter.
Yeah, sure.
So anyway, I then tried to get a job any place in journalism, whether it was marketing, whether it was working for a magazine. And every place I went, the first thing they did was take a look at me, and they said, "We're not hiring you." I said, "You didn't even look at my resume." They said, "We looked at your body. You're going to Vietnam." Yeah. I said, "That's against the law." They said, "We'll say we didn't like your resume." I said, "You didn't read my resume." So, yeah. Anyway.
That's something, boy. Wow. Yeah.
So I went to the Army, because I didn't know about going to Canada. I went to the Army. I said, I don't mind if I go to the Army, but I spent 4 years learning to be a journalist, 3 years really. I learned to be a journalist. Can you promise me I'll get on the Stars and Stripes? And the recruiter said to me, he was honest, he could have lied. He said, "Son, if the Army wants you to peel potatoes, you'll peel potatoes. if the army wants you to shoot a gun, you'll shoot a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew I was in trouble. So I figured I was going to enlist. And my friend, who's still my best friend, he said, you know what you could do? You get an exemption if you teach. And so he says, there's a special course that will give you 12 credits. You won't be a regular teacher. You'll be like a regular, like called New York City needed so many teachers. You'll be a regular substitute. And you'll be able to teach in the classroom as long as you then go get more credits.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that. In that summer, I took 12 credits, went for my license, my regular substitute license, went into a school where there were 8 new teachers, all men. Oh no, 10 new teachers, 8 were men. And why were we
Wow.
there?
Yeah.
And so I was put in a classroom with 46 kids, knew nothing about teaching. They destroyed me. And I said, I should have gone in the army. And,
Yeah.
but I tell you what, I stayed with it and I loved those kids. And by the end of the year, I loved teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I felt it was so meaningful. And I started to learn. I started learning how to manage a classroom. I started learning how to help kids learn by not by lecturing to them, but having them do things. And so after a while, I really enjoyed that job, but I still had the dream of becoming a writer.
Mm-hmm.
So after a couple of years, I kept writing and I started writing plays. And I then took off and just worked freelance. I was writing all kinds of different things to make a living, but I was writing plays because I love dialogue.
Uh-huh.
And I did 2 plays at a pretty well-known off-Broadway theater house called Circle Rep. And I loved it. I loved the experience of being in the theater. And so that was fun, interesting.
Jim,
And
Jim, if I may interrupt, what do you find more difficult, writing plays or novels?
oh God. Each one has its own challenges.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking a play might be more difficult to make the narrative move on. In other words, a novel, you can actually just write it out.
Yeah.
But in a play, everything comes out through the characters, more or less.
Right.
So, for me personally, I think a play would be tougher, but you said you have equally.
Yeah, each one has their own challenges. The thing about a play is that the actors and the director bring so much to their own characters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much more collaborative. With novels, everything is you. You know, it's your imagination. It's your choice of words. It's you picking, as you mentioned, why did you pick that setting? Why
Mm-hmm.
did that time? So the onus is, and the challenge in that is that you're responsible for everything. With the play, you're not as responsible. You're part of a collaborative effort.
You're more dependent, yeah.
And sometimes that works out. And sometimes you might write a great play and the acting is lousy. Well, in my play called Celebration of Brewer Street, the secondary character became the star. He was unbelievable. And yet he was so quiet during rehearsals, but somehow he had a gift. And now he's a pretty famous actor. He was in Better Call Saul, and he was in
one of my favorite shows, Jim.
Yeah, well, you know, the uncle who was in the wheelchair.
Of course, sure.
What was his name again?
Rings the bell.
Yeah, Ring the Bell. He was in my play.
Oh, how about that?
And he was unbelievably fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the main character became less interesting because of the quality of the acting. So anyway, so I'm writing plays and doing that, but you don't make any money writing plays. And I had to make money. So doing a lot of children's work and other kinds of things because they pay me, and they paid me advances too. Nice.
Nice.
So I say, I'm going to write a novel. And I started writing this novel, worked on for 4 years. And then I was with my girlfriend at the time, and we went up to New Hampshire to a local inn, and we were there for like a month. And I brought everything because I lived in East Village at the time. I lived above the Second Avenue Deli, which I was a little concerned about living above a restaurant, and afraid that all my notes and all my papers and manuscript and everything would burn in a fire.
Mhm.
So I go up to New Hampshire, and my manuscript and notes and tapes and everything burned in a fire.
Oh
It
my
was a
heavens.
hotel fire. And I was out on the lake with my girlfriend, and we'll look and we see smoke. And I think, well, they're having a barbecue. No, it was the inn on fire. And I was left,
Can you even describe that feeling
the feeling,
of what? Literally going up in smoke, your work?
I felt bereft. I felt grief. I felt that 4 years of my work and a lot of my effort and heart and everything was torn from me.
Yeah.
And a month later, I received in an envelope, a manila envelope, this envelope from the owner of the inn, who had no insurance, by the way. So I never got any compensation. And so she wrote, I don't know if you want this, but we found in the rubble, and there was 3 pages. They're half destroyed. You could see the charred around it. Still smelled with smoke. 3 pages of my manuscript. And so I then quit writing. And
just because you were
I said, why am I
depressed or okay?
Yeah, depressed. I was depressed. But I also said, why am I doing this? I've worked. I don't get paid much. It's hard. It's everything else. It's a tough business. I want to do something else. And so I went back to teaching because I loved it, and it was great and gave me a lot. But I guess I wanted to see what else. And I started taking courses in psychology and at NYU, and loved it, thought it was interesting. I love studying the mind, how the brain works, because we're still learning so much about the brain. And so it was fascinating, and I had some great professors. So I decided to pursue a doctorate in psychology. And so as I'm graduating, I'm doing an internship. You have to do a year's internship. I did a year's internship in a VA hospital, and I worked with severely traumatized Vietnam vets and others. I also worked in a community agency where I worked with families and couples, and so I had a lot of experiences. And I found it really rewarding, but I realized I don't like therapy as much as prevention. You know, I thought that I would. I thought what was great about teaching was that you have within your hands, or at least in your classroom, you have these little minds that you can do a lot to prevent, to nurture them. You can do a lot to prepare them for the world, so that they don't suffer all the indignities that some children suffer. And I had some children that also suffered tremendous indignities in their homes and everything else. So I knew the difference. So I wanted to get into prevention. So I joined up with a group called Resolving Conflict Creatively Program. And I worked as a trainer, I worked as a consultant, and gradually did more consulting work. And in kind of preventing violence, preventing, teaching social emotional learning, helping school systems to
stop it before it happens.
Teach children really basically how to manage their emotions, but also develop skills that will prepare them for life. And I loved it. So I worked in the New York City school system. I worked in New York State. I worked for, as a consultant. I worked in Holland. I worked in other places in New Jersey, places, I forget where, several places in New Jersey too. Anybody would hire me, and loved that work. And what happened was that I kept working, and I was going to go to Dubai and for a year to work with their school system. And I was a little nervous about it because it's a pretty somewhat repressive regime, and I didn't know if I would like it. But I was ready to go because it was an interesting experience. And I had a heart attack, and I came within. There was one night when I had a 5% chance of surviving.
Oh my
And
heavens!
I had a blood clot that hit in the artery that's called the widowmaker, because it makes so many widows. And I was always exercising, always healthy, had low cholesterol, but just so happened I had a clot. And my sister, twin sister, had died a month before from a clot.
Oh my
So there was something about us.
Yeah.
And we found out later what it was. It's something called Leiden 5 factor. And it means you have more tendency to have clots. And so I never went to Dubai. And my son said, well, you've been starting to write again. Why don't you just write, retire and write? And so that's what I started doing. That's a long story for.
No, not at all. I mean, if some positive can come out of a heart attack, you did, if you could.
Well, it's funny when I'm lying on the gurney and I'm thinking, I'm going to die tonight. I thought of my sister and my twin sister, and I turned to, I turned to my left and I said, Mary, we came in almost together, and we're going to go pretty close together. And I said, but I've lived a good life. I always worked at a job that I loved. And whether it was teaching, whether it was writing plays, whether it was, in psychology, working with people who, as a coach, as a leadership consultant, as somebody worked in school systems to try to make them more child-centered, I always loved my job. So I'm ready. And but luckily,
what year did you have your heart attack, Jim?
2010.
2010.
2010. And but luckily, I was told that I wasn't going to die. My urologist, believe it or not, told me that, Jim, when I said to him that I may die tomorrow, he said to me, Jim, you're young. You're going to live. I was 63. He says, you're going to live another 20 years. So my urologist has predicted when I'm going to die. Until I'm 83.
Okay. I have a feeling you could go beyond that, Jim.
I don't know. I mean, you'll have to talk to my urologist.
Yeah. Doctor, you and Jim are very close, as any urologist.
I don't know how he could tell, but.
Jim, what kid doesn't like horror? And I know I really appreciated the whole idea of the monster house in When We Were Wolves. I saw that could be taken for a double meaning, but I'm going to throw it to you. Tell us about as much as you can about the Monster House part of the book.
Well, you picked up on that double meaning. There's actually, the idea of the Monster House is such an important part of the book. And it's a motif that keeps appearing throughout the book, from the beginning to almost the very end. And at each time when Tom visits the Monster House, in the present time, but also in the past, when he describes in the backstory of the book, he describes his time in the Monster House. It's a time when he gets victimized.
Mm-hmm.
And yet also a place where he feels he feels a real attraction to. Because as you said, what kid doesn't like monsters and monster films? So it was my choice to have it keep appearing in the story, because it's the place where at first he feels very comfortable. He's invited into this house where Sonny lives as a young man. Sonny grew up in this house, and he inherited the house from his father. And he then, after he married, he constructed a part of the house that would serve as his film studio, because he liked to make monster films.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be a place where he could bring children, the players on his team, the children who played for him in this recreationally when he was young, because when he was young, he was known as being a great coach of young people, to the point that eventually he became so skilled and so well known, he kept moving ahead in his coaching career, to the point he eventually had the top job in America in terms of college basketball. And he won national championships. But when he was a young man, he was coaching rec teams before he got a job as teaching in high school. And in that capacity, he would bring his players into his house. And in that house, he would show them monster films, real monster films like Dracula and The Mummy, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. All these films that I loved as a child, and many people loved as a child. But he also made films. He created films where he would use his players as characters in his movies. And it turned out to be a way that he would groom the players. It would be a way to kind of seduce them into doing things that they normally wouldn't even think about, know about. And it was a way for him to groom them. And that's the psychological term for that. So it has that significance, but it also has a significance in the sense that later on, when we're in the present time, his friend Mark decides that he's going to make an art district. He's a big real estate developer.
Right.
He's going to make an art district. And at the centerpiece is Monster House. And everybody calls it Monster House because it was Sonny's boyhood home. It was the place where everybody knew you went there on Friday nights to see these monster films. Whether it was the real monster films, the commercial monster films, or Sonny's really good, they were really good monster films. So everybody knew it as that. So Mark decides to buy this house and make it a museum to Sonny, in honor of Sonny. And so again, it plays a part, and it's something that Tom finds revolting, that he has to, in some ways, keep quiet when his best friend invites him into Monster House, because what it does is remind him of the memories that he had there of
Yeah.
being betrayed. He not only learned basketball from Sonny, he learned what betrayal was.
Mhm.
And it happened
Yes.
there.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so it keeps coming back in the story in different ways and in different forms.
Mhm.
And so
Another example, Jim, as you mentioned before, as the town itself being a character,
yes,
in parts of the town, is another perfect example of that.
right, right.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of an art district too, when you think
Yeah.
about it,
Mm.
and that's true with so many places, small towns, they're trying to revitalize themselves, trying to make themselves something that they weren't, and they're trying to make themselves something else. And to get somebody like Sonny Rollins, who is now like one of the most famous people in America, to come back. And I love it because at one point, somebody says to him, his friend Jesse says to Mark, "This is a crazy idea. How many people are going to come see a museum dedicated to a guy who's alive?"
Right.
And so Mark says, "Well, they do it for Yogi Berra. Remember Yogi Berra?
Montclair, of course.
In
Sure.
Montclair." So it works perfectly. And in my estimation, Yogi Berra is not even as important as Sonny Rollins, the great Sonny Rollins.
Right.
So of course they would have a museum in his honor. But it also, here's the thing, because it's Monster House, and because it's Sonny Rollins, and because he's making a museum, Mark, he also knows that Sonny will come back and visit. And that sets up a clash between Sonny and Tom. And that is one of the most crucial catalytic points in the book,
And
which sets off a whole chain of issues and problems for Tom.
And as
Sonny comes back.
Yep, as a reader, it's that moment where I said to myself, okay, here we go. It's happening. Yeah.
You feel it. I felt it in writing it. I said, there's going to be explosion, and it's going to happen.
Yep.
And Monster House basically was the thing that brought them together. And it's interesting because Monster House is now this dilapidated house, which nobody would really want. And in it lives a woman and a young boy. And those two have a profound impact on Tom, because not only do they live in Monster House only for a brief time, but they also have impact on Tom because the boy reminds him of himself.
Yes.
And the woman is, as I mentioned before, she's one of those strong women who is going to make things happen. And she makes things happen in the book that, again, causes Tom to confront some issues that if it wasn't for her, he wouldn't have confronted. So
I must tell you, Jim, I admire the way throughout this whole talk we've had, how you have managed not to give away certain things like you were doing just now. And I'm listening to him saying, perfect, Jim, you're not giving things away, but you're telling certainly enough, and you did it masterfully throughout.
Oh, thanks, buddy. But because I think that there are so many places in the book that there are choices for the characters and choices for the reader. And I believe that you read the book, maybe someone else reads the book, and you have a very different take on the characters and the events that happen. And that's part of the wonder and joy of reading.
Yes.
I know myself, there are books that I read and I say, I don't like this, I don't find this interesting. And then I find somebody else who says, God, that book moved me in ways that's because we're all different human beings. We take in different things. We relate it to our own lives and our experiences, own needs and wants. And isn't it? The Joy of Reading?
That the joy of reading is right. Yep.
Yeah. So, and you had that when you taught those students in 8th grade to love literature. That's the key. And that's why we were talking about before about book banning. If you ban books because there's something in it that somebody may find offensive. Well, what about the 100,000 other people who would find that stimulating, interesting, life-changing? I know books that have changed my life.
Yes.
Now, if you ban some books, well, maybe you ban books that I never would have read, or maybe I would have read them and they didn't touch me. But maybe you ban one book that would have made all the difference in the world. And there have been those books for me.
Yes, me as well.
Give me an example. Just one. To Kill a Mockingbird. That's been banned many times.
My wife, Sue's favorite book and movie, but imagine that. Yes, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Imagine that. And why? Because some people might say, well, I get offended about how they portray white people. Well, there was some truth in that in those times.
Yes. Yeah.
And why shouldn't a student know about that?
Yep. And Harper Lee wasn't really, I mean, she was, of course, making a statement, but she was not drawing conclusions. She was presenting, this is the way it was.
This is the way
and you take from it what you may.
That's right. Right.
Yeah. So, Jim, I never asked you, why not James Tobin or Jim Tobin? Why J.E. Tobin as your author's name?
For simple reason. When I Googled my name, James Tobin, years ago, I encountered that there were like 1,000 references to a James Tobin, a Nobel Prize winning economist who had died recently. I mean, the last few years, I guess, died recently. But he was so prolific and so famous, he won the Nobel Prize, that my name, James Tobin, author of When We Were Wolves, would come maybe in about 5 years of searching down the line for James Tobin. So I decided that to use J.E. Tobin, because I figured when I Googled that, there were only a few references to a few other J.E. Tobins.
Well, I think it's cool. It's a cool name, a cool author's name, J.E. Tobin. Yep. So that's all right. There's my answer.
Simple answer, but it's true. It was practical.
Well, we mentioned throughout how you've written books upon books, and as the audience has seen throughout our interview, Jim, we've had your website up, jetobin.com. Before I mention some of your other books, I'm assuming in the usual places we can buy When We Were Wolves?
Right. I would say the easiest would be to Amazon.com.
Where I got mine.
BarnesandNoble.com. Also at PaleHorseBooks.com.
Yeah.
Which is my publisher, small publisher. So I would say those three places. And I've been trying to get into bookstores, but that's a little more difficult. They usually have larger publishers, because it means that it makes it easier for them to return books, and it makes it easier for them to order books than to order from small publishers.
Yeah. In other words, the usual places you'll find this book, everybody. You'll find it, and you will be, my goodness, so grateful that you did. I have it written down here, Jim, so if you don't mind me looking down, but I want to mention some of your other books, and then others that I may have missed that, please. But there are two children's books that I saw on your jetobin.com, The Trouble with Bubbles and The Land of Earth. How about, can we just give me a little thumbnail of those two before I go on, like The Trouble with Bubbles? What would that
Well, that was my great opus. That was my masterpiece. And it was for Macmillan and Company. And it was the story of a little girl who loved life, but one of the problems she had, the conflict she had, was that she loved bubbles. She loved making bubbles. And she spent a lot of her day making bubbles with her friends, with herself, and everything else. But one of the things that she was upset about was that no matter what she did, those bubbles would pop and disappear. And so she had the idea that she was going to invent the bubble that wouldn't pop. And so the trouble with bubbles is about the trouble she had trying to create this
What a great idea.
Unbreakable bubble. And since this book is no longer printed and in print, but you probably could still get it somewhere used.
eBay,
I'm not sure
somewhere
if I should tell you the ending, but I will tell you that it's a wonderful book, magical, because I'll give you just a heads up that she does create an unbreakable bubble. But what she discovers is that it may not be the best thing to have unbreakable bubble. And
nice.
I'll tell you no more. So it's delightful, it's funny, and yet it has a theme in it. It has messages in it about living your life, about what wishing, getting what you wish for, and finding sometimes that may not be the best thing to do.
Sounds like it's certainly worth searching for.
Yeah, I still have people who now read it to their children. And I still have a few copies myself.
I'll bet eBay would be a good place to look.
Yeah, in fact, I was able to, somebody just recently said that they found it somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, it shouldn't be very expensive, but I think sometimes somebody tries to make money on anything. And so they might try. And I would suggest don't bother, that there are so many other beautiful children's books that they could buy now that still is out there in print, including my favorite, The Orange Splot. For anyone who loves magic and loves children's books, get The Orange Splot by Daniel Pinkwater. Okay, that's a little tip.
All right, there's the recommendation from J.E. Tobin. How about the Land of the Earth?
The Land of the Earth is also another book that was published by Macmillan. And that was actually a play. The reason why they wanted to publish, why they wanted a play, was because they wanted it for their reading series. So they knew that I wrote children's musicals. This editor knew. I don't know how she knew, but she knew. And that's how she first contacted me. And she wanted me to sell her this musical that I wrote, that with a friend of mine. I wrote the book and lyrics, and she wanted me to just sell it to her for this reading series. But after she told me that, things have to play in Texas, even though I loved her, I didn't want to destroy a play that I really loved, because I already finished it, and this play was really good.
That was your baby.
So I said, I'll write you another play. So I wrote this thing called Land of Ear. And very simply, that was the story about a little girl who actually, I think it was maybe two kids, a boy and a girl, who come find a place where you get to be whatever you want to be. If you want to dress a certain way, if you want to look a certain way, and there are very weird characters in this place. In other words, you were living in the land of the free, but the free looked a little strange itself, the word. So that
Right.
was a play. That was a in the play. That was a play on words.
Gotcha.
That the
Uh-huh.
word "free" would even look a little strange. You'd have to guess at it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was then the story about how these two little children fall in love with this place and these people, these characters, and then realize that the characters are living in a place that's not theirs. It's owned by this group that wants to kick them off because they're different.
Mm,
Got it? And isn't that like a lot of places where
absolutely.
people want to remove people who are different from them? But this was a child's play. So
Mhm.
it was all in the imagination. And it was a fun play. And all my books were like that. It's funny because all the children's books are light and airy and happy and have some conflict in it. All stories have to have conflict,
Sure.
but they're magical. Whereas
Mhm.
all my adult things have really dark, heavy, not heavy, I would say dark, real issues
Yes. Yeah.
that come up. And like
Speaks
my
a lot to
play,
your talent, Jim.
yeah,
That you
well,
can, you can do both
so
sides.
in some ways that was my release, to have these wonderful, funny
Mhm.
children's plays,
Yeah.
children's books, because I could play like the Orange Squad. I could
Yes.
do something different and
Mhm.
be fun. Whereas I wanted to tell different stories because I think in some ways what it was for me was to pay back those writers who enabled me to learn from them and to gain something that made me a better person. So I think in my adult things, I always try to have uh, issues, themes that hopefully, cause people to think well, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
also, in learning about this person, maybe I learned something about myself.
Mhm. Um, moving away from the children's books, smart school leaders leading with emotional intelligence.
Right, right. So that was actually a textbook. That was
Right. Mhm.
a textbook for Kendall Hunt publishers. And they were looking for a, a textbook that could be used in college classrooms, graduate college classrooms, to teach school leaders how to create um, create better, more child-oriented schools that deal with emotional intelligence of
Mhm.
their students. And
Is it tough to write a
yeah,
textbook?
very tough.
Yeah, I would
Not so
imagine.
much, not so much fun, but challenging.
Yeah.
Uh, it was something I had been involved in this topic for a number of years, and that's why we were picked. And but what we had to do is a lot of research, and then part of it was based upon a 3-year research study I did with my co-writer, Dr. Janet Patty from
Mhm.
Hunter College, and it was on leadership in schools and what emotional intelligence can do, help school leaders in their efforts to be able to motivate others, to be able to lead, to be able to empathic, to be able to control their own emotions and
Mhm.
use their own emotions. So
Gotcha.
what we did is we used some of the stuff from our research, but we
Mhm.
also used a lot of stories of people out in the field who were actually doing this kind of work. And so it's something I'm very proud of. There were 2 editions.
Mhm.
And so that I think is still in print, but I
Mhm.
don't know too much about it because I stopped. I donated my royalties to the Children's Defense Fund.
Oh,
Yeah,
good for
and
you.
so I don't know what the sales are like. Probably
Yeah,
not too
but
sales now.
good for you, Jim.
Yeah,
That's
well,
very nice
I'm
to hear.
actually donating all the royalties to this book to a prevention, to preventing child abuse
Oh,
organization.
how wonderful is that, boy?
Well,
Something
partly because I think that I don't need money. I don't. One thing I did fairly well in life in terms of saving money and things like that, but also I don't need much, and I also want to give back because I like
Very
people
nice.
giving to me. When I went to college, I used a student defense loan, partly. So that was giving back to me from,
Yes.
people's taxes and stuff like that. So I've received a lot from other people, and I hope now to give back to others. So that's what I do.
Very nice to hear, Jim. Very nice to hear. We mentioned Triple Divide before. Is there a release date? I forget if I even asked you that question.
No, you didn't, but I wish there was a release date because I'm getting older, and but
You've only got about 50 years left, from what I can see.
right, from your mouth.
Both, yeah.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have a release date. It actually takes a long time to get a book from the final manuscript. Actually, it's never a final manuscript until it gets published, really, but printed. But from that point, then it has to go through all kinds of levels of production. Then it has to get a publication date, and then you have to get marketing. Then finally, it gets published. So it may be next year, hopefully early, or maybe longer. I don't know. This book took a long time, so I think also what's hard in the publishing business is that the publishing business has gotten smaller, and more of the publishing industry is geared for those few big selling authors. Well, not necessarily good authors. Some of them are not very good writers, but they sell.
Yeah.
So
follow the money.
You said it. So the industry is geared for that, but also it's geared for younger writers because they figure if I take a chance on this person's first book, even their second book, maybe by the third or fourth book, they'll start making money. But with an old timer like me, they say, how many books has he got in him? So it's harder for somebody a little bit older. People do. Grandma Moses sold painting.
Nothing like ageism, right, Jim?
Well, you deal with a lot of things in any business.
Yeah.
And so I'm just glad that I got this published, and I'm glad that some people are reading this, because that's all I really wanted, was somebody to find in a book what I've found in books in my life. So that's it.
Well,
passing on.
In front of everybody, when Triple Divide does come out and it becomes available, would you please come back on and talk with us about that book?
Good. Do you want me to tell you a little bit about the book now?
Please do.
Yeah, sure.
But wait, don't dodge my question there, Tobin. Will you come back though anyway and talk about it?
Sure, since we're both going to be around for another 50 years.
Exactly. We have plenty of time. So please, tell us about it, please.
Okay. Triple Divide is a book about three men, three special forces operatives who are in Afghanistan. And something happens in a village which troubles all of them, but especially one man. And he comes back, and he is suffering, and he decides to travel to Montana, meet his mother who lives there, and then walk off into the wilderness. And we don't know in the beginning why he's doing that, but we have our guesses. We have a guess that he might be going to commit suicide in a way that he hopes to get some redemption for what happened in that village, but also back when they returned to the base. which it was in Bagram Air Force Base. And the book opens up shortly after the last, shortly after the men, not the men, these men, but shortly after the Afghan war ends, 13 days afterwards. And one of the men, who is one of the protagonists, he's going to Arlington. And we're not sure, when we start the book, who he's going to see, what he's going to see. But he's very directed to getting there, not do anything else in Washington. He got off the train, he's going to Arlington. Then the next chapter is, we go back, and that's the story of what happened in the village. And what transpires after that young man, 30-something years old, a sergeant, Alex, he walks off into the Glacier National Park without anything to survive, really. And his two other friends decide they're going to find him, rescue him, for different reasons. They have different reasons for going. And they take on two different missions because they're separated, but also for other reasons. And so they're apart, all three men, and they're going to a mountain. They eventually go to a mountain called Triple Divide. And so there's again the motif of three. And it's a story of courage, it's a story of friendship, it's a story of redemption. And what we do as a society when we send men off to war, and women, it's important too. And the families that are left behind, because the families of all three men play an important role too in this. In fact, one of them who goes off with his son to try to find his friend, is an ex-Vietnam veteran, is a Vietnam veteran who has his own issues, with what happened in the Vietnam War. But he wants to help his son. But he's going there also for his own form of redemption. So it's called Triple Divide. And
I can't wait to read it.
It's a good book. It's a good book, but very different than this one.
Well, I look forward to it. And I look forward to you coming back on the show and speaking with us about it.
Good.
Now, audience, I want you to know, a couple of days ago, I had emailed Jim just to kind of, finalize speaking today. And he said, I'm feeling a little under the weather, but yeah, I'm raring to go. Everyone, Jim Tobin is in the throes of COVID. He did this whole interview and he is suffering from the COVID flu. So Jim, talk about the show must go on.
You're right.
Thank you so much for fighting through your illness to be with us today.
Well, it's actually been good therapy.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'll send you the bill, and and when the check clears, I'll run the interview.
And I'll send you back something too.
Jim, I can't thank you enough. It was such a pleasure speaking with you, meeting with you. Hope someday we can actually shake hands in person. And but until then, I look forward to speaking with you again about Triple Divide. And can't thank you enough for all the time you gave us.
Well, Steve, it's been a pleasure to meet you after communicating with you via email, and also to learn that my brother blocked for you when you ran through the line. And North Bergen had some very good teams. So.
Yeah, we were the good old Bruins, the Scarlet and Gold, Jim. We'll talk again, okay?
Okay, Steve.
Thank you, Jim. Bye-bye.
Classic pop culture. It's classic pop culture. Hosted by Steve, Ludwig, and Vladimir. Classic pop
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.